Hello everyone, welcome back. This is Avorion episode 53. I'm Enigmius, and today the station build continues, albeit just a little bit crippled at this point. I decided that I wanted to fill in this section in the outer ring with torpedo storage, whatever the exact block is called. I don't really necessarily expect that the ship is going to be firing so many torpedoes that we need to invest a large amount of space for that purpose, but it seemed like a useful way to invest this space, perhaps more so than just hull blocks. The idea being that we have integrity field generators that are going to be helping us out, so we don't have to worry so much about individual sections of the ship taking focus damage and losing things as a result of it. But at the same time, trying to find a comfortable balance between what the game allows, what the game requires, and what I'm comfortable with. And in this case, I decided that I was comfortable with using the torpedo storage for this particular section. Now, I've considered a lot of different profiles for this top section of the outer ring, and I've mentioned a couple of times already. Ultimately, what I decided I would do would be to just have sort of a bit of a curve and then flatten off at the top, and you can see we're starting to set that up. I was hoping to get a bit more of a curve up towards the top section, but what ended up happening was I started to create that curve where it was easy to make that curve, and then when I started getting to the compound curves involving that curve, it was quickly apparent that it wasn't going to work. So kind of had to set that aside. It's not the end of the world. It wasn't something that I had my heart set on. It was just a concept that didn't quite make it past the mental imagery stage. It just kind of fell flat as soon as I started trying to implement it. Once we get this all closed in, basically the outer ring will be done. I'm noticing, you'll see from time to time, ships have begun docking with the station, even while we're building it, even while we have no crew. And the ship doesn't actually seem to serve any particular purpose right now. People are still docking with us. I'll still occasionally get messages when they dock that we've gained something, they've traded something to us, or they've traded something to us and in exchange they've taken something that someone else traded to us. It's kind of neat in the sense that things are happening automatically, and you've got that. For me, what is a really fun element of a lot of games is that low maintenance resource acquisition and control kind of metagame, where you set up things that produce resources even if you're not around to specifically guide them, and the end result is you come back from time to time and you've got all this stuff and you get to decide what you want to do with it. So that's kind of a fun thing for me anyways, and it's nice to see that already happening, even though the station is not what I would call, by any means, complete. Now you see here we've got sort of a gap between this top layer that I just put in and the top layer of the torpedo storage. This is an area where I feel like it's really appropriate to fill in with hull blocks, because it's empty space, and if we leave the empty space and then things do end up getting damaged, the station takes an absolute beating, and when the integrity field generators start failing, there's nothing really there to protect the equipment. I would feel kind of silly because we had an opportunity, but one of the things that I did was I waited too long as I was placing these top sections to get in there and start filling in the gap with the hull blocks. So it's kind of a pain at this point, and you'll see fairly soon I'll actually try and use the visibility feature to turn off all of the blocks that I'm not really concerned about, and see if that helps me to get things lined up properly to fill things in with the hull blocks. It doesn't really do all that much to help me. But one of the things that you might notice if you watch closely, and this currently is being played back at the usual speed that I play back build videos, which is 4 times the actual gameplay speed. And when I'm placing blocks, you'll see there's actually quite a substantial gap between the time that I place the block and the time that the block actually shows up on the spot where I put it, you can see now, you can see the little green outline of the outside angle block that I'm placing, and then trailing along behind it by a fairly wide margin is the actual block showing up in the game. Additionally, every once in a while, if you look in the background when I'm doing that, when I'm placing blocks and they aren't being placed in time with when I'm placing them, all of the ships in the background will be doing pirouettes. They just sit there and spin around. So this is kind of my indication that we are at about the outer limits of what the game will allow. We can only push so hard before things just kind of go completely out of control, and the game loses its ability to recover from it in a constructive fashion. Usually what will end up happening when we push a game too far is it will just immediately crash to the desktop, or it will encounter some sort of internal error and boot you back to the loading screen type thing, or the loading menu when you first load the game. That's where you end up. So I had to be a little bit careful in terms of what I had planned for the central cylinder of the station relative to what I originally had in mind before we started pushing the game to the extent that it doesn't really want to cooperate with anything anymore. And I've decided that I want to keep it simple. I want to keep it as simple as possible. I want to try and keep you can see just flipping around in the background. I want to keep things, I want to keep the block count as low as possible without just saying, okay, well, we've taken it as far as we can and just stopping altogether. I have to invest more blocks in order to get it to a stage where I'm happy that that it is where it is, that it's going to be able to do the things that it's capable of and have that roughly in line with what I had originally intended. There's always, for me anyways, quite a lot of wiggle room between what I would like, in this case the station, but usually the ship, to be able to do versus what it looks like. There's usually always a solution to be had if the performance isn't quite where we want it, regardless of how it looks, that we can make some adjustments to get the performance where we want it and eventually end up with something that we're happy with the appearance of. I don't always exercise all of that. You may have noticed, especially with Avorion, a lot of my builds, we get to a point where it's structurally complete and it has the basics in place that would allow it to do the ship to, you know, perform a certain way. And then I release the blueprint and I move on, even though it's not necessarily a high-performing ship. It's something that can be tweaked, it's something that can be modified, but I don't necessarily push for that performance kind of over everything else. In the case of the station, I feel kind of the same. I have options that I can kind of modify the way things are behaving if I'm not happy with the way that they're performing, that we can do independently of the aesthetic aspect of things. But at the same time, in this case, I'm not really feeling like I need to sacrifice a lot of aesthetics in order to get the performance without crashing the game. So that's sort of the new element that we have to consider in the grand scheme of things, is that we're no longer trying to balance the way the station performs with how it looks. We're trying to balance how it performs with how it looks, with whether or not the game can handle it. Fortunately, when I leave build mode, the game behaves much better, and I'm assuming that there's more efficient rendering, that the game has to consider fewer things rendering it in the normal game mode compared to what it has to do in build mode, and that's why we get the increase in performance. But I don't want to push myself, I definitely don't want to push myself into the position where any one single structure or ship that I've created is causing performance problems in normal gameplay mode, because then you kind of limit what you can do in that area. When you're already, like I was talking about recently, there's that threshold, and when you've got one structure that pushes you to that threshold and maybe a little bit farther, there's no room to add anything else. There's no room to have AI ships to trade with or to fight with, or other stations to really interact with in a meaningful way, because you've already got this one sort of thing that's in the way of everything that you're trying to do. It's causing performance problems. So we've got this outer ring, you can see I've turned off the all of the blocks except for the regular Xanian hull blocks, so that hopefully I can see a little bit more clearly where I'm trying to place these blocks to fill in the gaps and get this thing closed up. That's all I'm trying to do. At this point, there's no consideration for equipment that we're placing, whether or not such and such is going to be good enough. It's just getting this thing closed up, filled in, and making a very poor decision about how to go about that. What I really should have done, and what I will end up doing before this is all said and done, is placing a few blocks across the top and then placing a few blocks underneath them to fill the gap, and placing more across the top, and then, very simple kind of thing. But when you're in the middle of it, sometimes the simplest options are the ones that are a little bit elusive. And in this case, it'll get done. I'm confident that it'll get done. But one of the things that I've been considering, and this is related to how many blocks we're using to build the station at this point, is when we've got these rounded sort of shapes, we kind of put ourselves in a position where we have suddenly a minimum block count to do anything with those pre-existing shapes. So if we've got a circle, for example, with a diameter of 660 blocks, like the outer circle of the outer ring, there's a certain number of blocks that go to make up that perimeter. And then there are certain things that we can do to add to that particular size and shape. But there's always a limit to the number of, or there's always a minimum number of blocks that we need in order to make that work, in order to keep it matching that profile, even if we're transitioning it to a different profile. And in this case, you can see we're kind of going around in a circle here on the central cylinder. I didn't show you the process of covering off the capping, basically the top of this central cylinder, because we've just placed a whole bunch of blocks in a marginally not especially interesting part of the build. I didn't think it was necessary to do it all over again. But what I'm doing now is I'm creating blocks, and these blocks that I'm placing are just temporary, and they're specifically for the purpose of creating sort of like a spacer, so that we can put in this platform that we're placing now, and then immediately on top of this platform, matching it exactly, we're going to put some light blocks, and then we're going to cap it off with another platform with Xanian hull blocks that's identical to the one that we're placing now. And we're creating a sandwich basically with light blocks in between. And this is going to be the basis of the remainder of the structure for the station, is having these sandwiches sort of extending. The benefit is that we're able to cover a little bit more distance because we've got a gap in between the sandwiches, is kind of one of the keys here. It gives us the ability to add volume to the ship, size. When you're looking at it, it looks bigger without necessarily adding all of those extra blocks that you might need if you were going to do, the lighting the same way. You would have to add additional blocks just to fill in those gaps. If you wanted to do it in a manner, see, we just crashed. Just trying to place stuff, and the damn thing crashed. So we're saving a few blocks, not a lot, but a few, in the process of filling this in and leaving little gaps in between. This top section I had originally had in mind to do like a spheroid kind of thing. If you imagine like a sphere and then squishing it, pushing down on it from the top, that deformed kind of shape that you'd end up with. I'd sort of envisioned that for being this particular part of the station. Because of the number of blocks involved and the complexity of having those kinds of compound curves in play, I've decided that that's just not really going to be the best decision that I could make. It would be far more than I think the game would be able to handle. So instead, we're going to go with these sandwiches. This top section, we're going to have a few rows or a few layers of the sandwich, and then they're going to start getting a little bit smaller and smaller as they work their way to the top of the structure, so that it'll be the illusion of a curve without having to have all of the blocks that make it a compound curve. It'll have sort of that profile to it when you look at it from a distance, but without the need to set it up as a solid sort of shape. This part here is where the game really just started to say enough is enough. I wanted to put a hanger on this station, and it seems to me very, very important to do so. What I'm doing now is I'm trying to use the cut and paste feature to basically paste layers in this bottom section of the ship the same way that I had put them in the top section, but much faster, and just getting them lined up wound up being a little bit more difficult than I was sort of expecting. It just didn't want to line up the way I expected it to. But then we ended up with, see that flat piece with, it's got strips of light on either side? It's just kind of sitting there on the bottom of the station now. It's not actually there. It's an artifact. It doesn't have any substance. You can't select it. It doesn't get in the way of any blocks that you're trying to place. It's just there. And the only way I could get rid of it was by exiting to the title menu and then loading back in. We can see here, eventually we did get everything sorted out so that we have the stacked layers on the bottom, and then we put, relatively speaking, a fairly beefy hanger in that square shaped cavity that we created when we removed the center portion of those sandwiches. So it actually, in the end, well, see, trying to get rid of it, we got rid of the artifact, and now we're able to kind of get a better feel for how things are going to go together. We get the hanger in place. We've got some more work to do on the underside just to kind of finish off the appearance of it. Right now it looks a little bit dull, I find, so we're going to be a little bit careful about what we expect from that. But then we've got the top section. Like I said, we're going to do like a compound curve without having to do a solid compound curve. Then we're going to expand this station. We're going to make it larger so that it is it's actually got meaningful values for all the things like cargo and torpedo storage and hangar space, etc., etc. Because right now it's so absolutely tiny that it's not very useful. I don't think in the long term we can't expect it to do a whole lot. So we're getting towards the end of this specific build, partly because of the performance issues and partly because we're getting to the end of sort of what I had in mind, limited by those performance issues. So the next episode, we're just going to continue on. We're going to finish off what we can, and within, I would say, at the absolute most, 2 to 3 episodes, we'll be releasing a blueprint for this guy, and then we'll be on to our next ship build, which I've had in mind since before we even started the station build. So we've still got plenty to do, and if you want to be notified when we add future videos to this and other series, the easiest way to do that is to subscribe to my channel or follow me on social media. Links for social media are always in the information section below the video. Feel free to leave your comments and feedback. Thanks for watching, guys, and take care.